The shuttle docked with a low hum that vibrated through the metal walls, and Kira Vasquez pressed her face against the window to catch her first look at the Galactic Union Academy, a station the size of a small city, spinning slowly in the golden light of a dying star above the neutral world of Velhari 9. She was 19 years old, born and raised in Sao Paulo on a planet that the rest of the galaxy apparently considered a nightmare, and she was about to walk into a school filled with species that had been traveling between stars for thousands of years before her ancestors had even figured out fire. No pressure at all. The airlock opened with a hiss, and Kira stepped through into a corridor so wide and tall that she could have driven a truck through it without touching the ceiling, and every surface gleamed with a pale blue light that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once, and the air tasted faintly of something sweet, like flowers she had never smelled before, filtered and recycled and perfectly controlled to suit as many species as possible. She adjusted the strap of her bag on her shoulder and started walking. A holographic sign floated above the corridor in 12 different languages, and one of them was English, added just 3 years ago, when humanity had made first contact with the Union, stumbling into the galactic community like a confused toddler wandering into a boardroom full of executives. Kira followed the signs toward the student registration wing, and she tried not to stare at the beings around her, but it was impossible not to. A creature that looked like a walking crystal formation drifted past her, its body chiming softly with every step, and behind it came a pair of tall insectoids with wings folded tight against their backs, clicking to each other in a language that sounded like rain on a tin roof, and then a group of something she could only describe as floating jellyfish, translucent and glowing faintly purple, drifting through the air in a cluster, and leaving a faint trail of bioluminescent particles behind them. She had studied the species files for months before coming here, memorizing names and customs and biology, but seeing them in person was something else entirely. At the registration desk, a thin amphibian with enormous dark eyes scanned her student card and then looked up at her with an expression she could not quite read. "Human," the amphibian said, and the word came through her translator with a strange flatness to it, like it was a word the device had only recently learned. "That is correct," Kira said, smiling. The amphibian blinked twice, very slowly, and then handed back her card without another word. She found her dormitory on the 7th ring of the station, a small but clean room with a bed that was slightly too long for her, a desk, a window that looked out into the blackness of space, and a gravity setting that had been adjusted to match Earth standard, which meant it was noticeably heavier than the rest of the station. The Union had Earth classified as a Class 12 Deathworld, which was apparently a very big deal, and Kira had not fully understood what that meant until she had read the official file. Extreme gravity by galactic standards. Most species came from worlds with 60 to 70% of Earth's pull, and some from worlds with even less, which meant that Kira's bones were denser, her muscles were stronger, and her cardiovascular system was built like an engine compared to the delicate machinery that kept most galactic citizens alive. Toxic atmosphere, she breathed oxygen, which was a corrosive gas that most species avoided the way humans avoided chlorine, and her lungs processed it like it was nothing, because on Earth it was *nothing. It was just air. Predatory megafauna, tectonic instability, extreme weather, a biosphere that operated on the principle of competitive evolution where every living thing was locked in an endless war to eat or be eaten. And somehow, against all odds, a species of hairless primates had clawed its way to the top of the food chain and then looked up at the stars and said, "Let us go there." Most species in the Union found that story either inspiring or terrifying, and Kira was not sure which reaction was more common. She unpacked her things, hung a small photo of her family on the wall beside the bed, and went to find the dining hall. That was where she met Lyse. Lyse was a Kelvari, a small, four-armed herbivore with soft lavender skin and enormous golden eyes that seemed to take up half her face, and she was sitting alone at a table in the corner of the hall, eating something that looked like blue moss from a shallow bowl, and she looked so profoundly lonely that Kira's heart hurt just looking at her. "Is this seat taken?" Kira asked, gesturing to the empty chair across from her. Lysay looked up, startled, and her forearms pulled tight against her body in what Kira recognized from her studies as a Kelvari fear response. You are the human," Lysay whispered. "I am Kira," she said, sitting down and setting her tray on the table with a smile that she hoped was reassuring and not terrifying, because she had also read that some species found the human practice of baring teeth deeply unsettling. But Lysay did not seem frightened of the smile. If anything, she seemed relieved that anyone was willing to sit with her. They talked for an hour, and Kira learned that Lysay was studying botanical xenoscience, that she had been at the academy for 2 months, that she had no friends, and that she cried almost every night because she missed her family, and because the other students either ignored her or worse. "Worse?" Kira asked. Lysay looked down at her bowl and said nothing. Over the next few days, Kira also met Doran, a Mechari, an amphibian species with mottled green-blue skin and calm, thoughtful eyes that rarely blinked, and he was quiet in a way that Kira found comfortable rather than awkward, and the three of them began eating together every day. A little island of misfits in a sea of species that had been part of the galactic community for millennia. Kira was happy. She went to her classes, studied hard, asked too many questions, and tried to ignore the whispers that followed her everywhere: Deathworlder, an oxygen breather and predator species. And she told herself that it would get better, that people would see her as just another student eventually. And then one evening, she walked into the dining hall and saw something that made her stop in her tracks. Lysay was standing near the food dispensers, her tray on the floor, blue moss scattered across the tiles, and her forearms were wrapped around herself in that tight, terrified posture that Kira had seen on their first meeting, and standing over her was a group of 5 alien students, tall and broad and scaled, laughing in low, rumbling voices. And at the center of the group, towering over all of them, was the biggest alien Kira had ever seen, 7 feet tall, 4 arms thick with muscle, a tail like a battering ram, and a mouth full of teeth arranged in a smile that had nothing to do with friendliness. He was saying something to Lysay, something that made the little Kelvari flinch, and the translator in Kira's ear caught the tail end of it, a pathetic little grass seeder. Kira set her jaw, and something quiet and old and very, very patient woke up behind her eyes. She started walking toward them. His name was Torvek Ran, and he had ruled the Galactic Union Academy for 3 years with nothing more than his size, his temper, and a family name that made the faculty look the other way. He was Draxari, a species that came from a mid-tier world called Draxus Prime, where the gravity was about 70% of Earth standard, and the biggest predators had been hunted to extinction 10,000 years ago, and the Draxari had built their entire civilization on the idea that the strong were meant to command, and the weak were meant to obey. Torvek believed this the way most people believed in gravity, not as an opinion, but as a fundamental law of the universe. He stood 7 feet and 2 inches tall, with 4 arms that ended in clawed hands capable of crushing metal, a thick reptilian tail that he used for balance and for intimidation in equal measure, and scales the color of dark iron that covered his body like natural armor, and he had never once in his life met a being that did not back down when he wanted them to. He was the son of a minor noble house, and his family funded an entire wing of the Academy's research division, which meant that when Torvek shoved a smaller student into a wall, the faculty wrote it up as a cultural misunderstanding. And when Torvek broke a Kelvari student's arm during a so-called friendly sparring match last semester, the official report called it an accident during physical education. Everyone knew the truth, and nobody did anything about it. Torvik had a crew, 5 other Draxari students, and a handful of hangers-on from other species, who had decided that standing beside the bully was safer than standing in front of him. And together, they controlled the social order of the academy like a small empire, deciding who could sit where in the dining hall, who got access to the best study rooms, and who got to walk through the main corridors without being shoved aside. And their favorite target was lice. The Kelvari were everything the Draxari despised: small, soft, herbivorous, peaceful to the point of passivity, and completely incapable of fighting back. And Lysae was the smallest and softest of them all, alone at the academy without a single member of her species to support her, and Torvik had singled her out on her very first day and had not stopped since. He knocked her trays out of her hands, mocked her in front of crowds, blocked her path in hallways and made her squeeze past him while his crew laughed, and once he had taken her study tablet and held it above her head while she jumped for it with all 4 arms, and he had laughed so hard that his tail had cracked the floor tile beneath him. It was not personal for Torvik, or at least, that was what he told himself. It was simply the natural order, the strong reminding the weak of their place, and if the little grass-eater did not like it, she could go home to her gentle little world and never bother the real species again. That was the scene Kira walked into. She crossed the dining hall with steady steps, not fast and not slow, and the other students parted around her without thinking about it, the way water parts around a stone, and she did not realize it, but several of them shivered as she passed. Some old instinct buried deep in their biology, recognizing something in her movement, something smooth and deliberate, and focused in a way that their ancestors would have recognized as a predator locking onto a target. Kira reached the group and bent down and picked up Lysae's tray without a word, gathering the scattered blue moss back onto it with careful hands, and then she straightened up and turned to face Torvik. The top of her head came up to the middle of his chest. "That is enough," she said, and her voice was calm and clear and carried no anger in it at all, just a simple statement of fact, like she was telling someone the time. Torvik looked down at her, and for a moment he did not speak, because his brain was trying to process what was happening. This tiny creature, this soft-skinned, 2-armed, blunt-toothed little thing from a backwater planet that had only discovered space travel a few decades ago, was standing in front of him and telling him what to do. His crew exchanged glances behind him, and one of them let out a low, disbelieving laugh. "What did you say to me?" Torvik asked, and he leaned down so that his face was close to hers, and his breath smelled like copper and something acidic. "I said that is enough," Kira repeated, and she did not step back, did not look away, did not flinch, and her eyes, brown and steady and utterly unafraid, locked onto his and held them. Torvik felt something strange in that moment, a tiny flicker of something he could not name, like a cold finger tracing down the back of his neck, and he crushed it immediately because Torvik Rand did not feel fear, not from anything and certainly not from a creature half his size. He straightened up and put one massive clawed hand on Kira's shoulder and shoved her backward. She stumbled 3 steps but did not fall, and her shoes squeaked against the polished floor as she caught herself, and she looked down at the spot where his claws had pressed into her shoulder. There would be bruises there tomorrow, 4 neat circles of purple against her brown skin, and then she looked back up at him. And she said, very quietly, in a voice that somehow carried to every corner of the silent dining hall, "Do not do that again." Torvik stared at her. Then he laughed, a big, booming, theatrical laugh that his crew picked up and echoed, and he turned his back on her and walked away, because she was beneath him, because she was nothing, because she was a tiny mammal from a rock the galaxy had barely heard of, and he would deal with her when he felt like it and not a moment before. But as he walked away, something bothered him, something in the way she had stood there, something in the way her body had absorbed the shove and recovered so quickly, something in the way her eyes had not changed at all when he put his hands on her, not wider with fear or narrower with pain, just the same steady calm. He pushed the thought away. Later that evening, in his quarters, surrounded by his crew, Torvik cracked his neck and flexed his forearms and said the words that he would come to regret more than any words he had ever spoken in his life. "The little Deathworlder needs to learn her place," he said, and his crew grinned and nodded. "Tomorrow we teach her." His second-in-command, a Draxari named Voss, hesitated for just a moment and said, "Torvik, the file on her species, the Union classification. I read that humans come from a Class 12 world, and that is—" "I know what class her world is," Torvik snapped. "A high number does not make a small creature dangerous. Voss, it makes a small creature * lucky to be alive." Voss said nothing more, but he pulled up the human species file on his tablet after Torvik left the room, and he read it twice, and then he read it a third time, and then he quietly placed a bet against Torvik in the Academy's underground betting pool. The first time he had ever bet against his leader. Because Voss, unlike Torvik, understood what a Class 12 Deathworld actually meant. And he was very, very glad that he was not the one who had shoved Kira Vasquez. The central atrium of the Academy was a massive open space beneath a transparent dome that showed the stars, and it was always crowded during the midday break, filled with hundreds of students from dozens of species eating and talking and studying, and that was exactly why Torvik chose it. He wanted an audience. Kira was sitting with Lysa and Doran at their usual table near the fountain when the crowd around them suddenly went quiet, and the silence spread outward like a ripple in water, and she looked up to see Torvik walking toward her with his full crew behind him, all of them wearing the formal dark sashes of the Draxari warrior caste, and she understood immediately what was happening even before he opened his mouth. "Human," Torvik said, and his voice boomed across the atrium, amplified by the natural acoustics of the dome. "I invoke the Ranthari." A gasp moved through the crowd, and Kira heard Lysa make a small, broken sound beside her. The Ranthari was a Draxari honor duel, an ancient tradition that the Galactic Union had grudgingly recognized as a legitimate form of cultural conflict resolution under interspecies law, meaning that any student could invoke it, and any student who refused would be formally branded a coward under Union social code, which carried real consequences: loss of standing, loss of protections, open season for anyone who wanted to harass you without repercussion. It was a trap, and it was a very good one. "You put your hands on me yesterday," Torvik continued, loud enough for everyone to hear, though they both knew it was the other way around. "Under Draxari law, I have the right to demand satisfaction, and I demand it now. A physical bout, no weapons in the ceremonial ring tomorrow at sunset, unless the human would prefer to admit that her species lacks the courage to face a true warrior." He smiled down at her, and every tooth in his mouth was visible. Kira looked at him for a long moment, and then she looked at Lysa, whose golden eyes were filling with tears, and then she looked at Doran, who was staring at his datapad with an expression she could not read. "I accept," Kira said. The atrium erupted, voices overlapping in a dozen languages, bodies pressing forward to get a better look, translator devices buzzing and crackling as they tried to keep up. And Torvik's smile widened because this was exactly what he had wanted, a public spectacle, a chance to crush the little Deathworlder in front of everyone and restore the natural order of things. He turned and walked away, his crew falling in behind him, and the crowd parted to let them through. The moment he was gone, Lysa grabbed Kira's arm with all four hands and said, "No, no, no, you cannot do this, you cannot. He will kill you, Kira. He will break you apart, please, please take it back. I would rather be called a coward for the rest of my life than watch you get hurt because of me." "He is not going to kill me," Kira said gently, putting her hand over Lysa's. "You do not understand," Lysa said, and her voice was shaking. "He broke a Kelvari student's arm last year, and that student was bigger than you, and the Draxari are one of the strongest species in the mid-tier worlds, and he has 4 arms, Kira, 4 arms and claws and armored scales. And you are. Small, Kira said, and there was something in her voice that was almost amused. Soft, Lysay whispered, and the word sounded like a death sentence in her mouth. Doran had not said a word through any of this, and Kira glanced at him and saw that he was still looking at his datapad, scrolling through something with his webbed fingers, and his large dark eyes were very, very wide. Doran, she said. He looked up at her, and then he looked at Lysay, and then he set the datapad face down on the table and said, in his quiet, measured voice, I think Lysay does not need to worry as much as she thinks she does. He did not explain, and Kira did not ask him to, and Lysay was too upset to notice the strange calm in his words. By evening, the entire academy knew about the duel, and betting pools had opened on every level of the station, and the odds were 300 to 1 against the human, and some students were betting not on whether Kira would lose but on how many seconds she would last before Torvek put her on the ground. In the faculty wing, a door burst open, and a small insectoid professor named Dr. Ilwyn came scuttling into the faculty council chamber on 6 legs, her compound eyes flashing with agitation, and she slammed a datapad onto the conference table hard enough to crack the screen. You have to stop this duel, she said. The faculty head, a tall crystalline being named Chancellor Vorathi, looked at her with the patient disinterest of someone who had been interrupted during dinner and said, Dr. Ilwyn, the Ranthari is a recognized cultural practice under Union law, and we have no grounds to intervene. I am not concerned about the law, Dr. Ilwyn snapped. I am concerned about the Draxari boys' survival. That got the room's attention. Dr. Ilwyn pulled up a holographic display from her cracked datapad, and the air above the table filled with data, charts and graphs and biological readouts, and a spinning model of a small blue planet third from a yellow star. Earth, she said, Class 12 Deathworld, and before any of you dismiss that number, let me remind you that the highest rating any of your homeworlds received was a Class 5, and most of you come from Class 2 or Class 3 worlds, and the difference between each class is not linear, it is exponential. She tapped the display, and the data shifted. Human bone density, 3 times the galactic average, because their planet's gravity is 30% higher than standard, and their bodies evolved to carry weight that would cripple most of us, and their skeletal structure is reinforced with a calcium phosphate matrix that makes their bones harder than Draxari scales. Another tap. Muscle fiber composition, a mix of fast-twitch and slow-twitch fibers that gives them both explosive power and endurance that no other known species can match, and they are what their planet calls persistence predators, meaning their evolutionary strategy was not to be the fastest or the strongest, but to simply never, ever stop chasing their prey until it collapsed from exhaustion. Another tap. Pain response. And this is the part that should frighten all of you. When a human is injured, their body releases a chemical called adrenaline that suppresses pain, increases heart rate, floods the muscles with oxygen-rich blood, sharpens reaction time, and temporarily increases strength by a factor that we are still trying to measure accurately. Because every time we think we have found the upper limit, some human somewhere lifts a ground vehicle off a trapped child, and we have to recalibrate. The room was very quiet. Their species has a term for it, Dr. Ilwyn said. They call it hysterical strength, and they talk about it casually, the way you or I might talk about sneezing, and they do not seem to understand that no other species in the known galaxy has anything remotely like it. Chancellor Vorathi leaned forward and said, Dr. Ilwyn, the Ran boy is twice her size. He has 4 arms. He has natural armor, and he is one of the finest young fighters in the Draxari student exchange. Surely you are not suggesting that a single human girl. I am suggesting, Dr. Ilwyn said, and her voice was hard and sharp, that you are measuring the wrong things. Chancellor, size and armor and number of limbs are meaningless when you are facing a creature whose entire evolutionary history is a 10-million-year arms race against a planet that tried to kill it every single day, and that creature won. She looked around the room at the assembled faculty, brilliant minds, every one of them, and not a single one seemed to understand what she was telling them. She comes from a world where the asterisk weather kills more people every year than most species lose in wars, Dr. Ilwin said, and her voice dropped low. She breathes poison, she sweats acid. Her immune system fights off microscopic invaders that would wipe out a Calvari colony in days. And when she is hurt, when she is frightened, when her back is against the wall, her body does not shut down the way ours do, it turns on. It unlocks reserves of strength and speed that she does not even have access to under normal conditions, and she becomes something that your threat models are not equipped to calculate. Silence. Stop the duel, Dr. Ilwin said, not for her, for him. Chancellor Vorathi looked at the data hovering in the air, and then he looked at Dr. Ilwin, and then he shook his head slowly and said, "The Ranthari is legally protected, and the Rand family would withdraw their funding if we intervened. And I am sorry, Doctor, but I cannot cancel a recognized cultural practice based on theoretical biology." Dr. Ilwin stared at him for a long, long moment, and then she gathered her broken datapad and turned and walked out of the chamber, and as the door closed behind her, she whispered to no one, "You fools, you absolute fools." That night, alone in the Academy gymnasium, Kira wrapped her hands with strips of cloth she had brought from Earth, an old habit from the boxing gym in Sao Paulo where her grandmother had taught her to fight when she was 12 years old. And she rolled her shoulders, and she bounced on the balls of her feet, and she shadowboxed in the empty room, her fists cutting the air with a speed that would have made Dr. Ilwin's compound eyes go very wide indeed. She was not scared. She was not angry. She was just ready. The ceremonial ring was a wide circle of polished stone set into the floor of the Academy's oldest hall, carved with symbols from 100 different warrior traditions. And by the time Kira arrived, every seat in the surrounding gallery was filled, and students were standing 3 deep along the upper balconies, and camera drones floated in the air like silver insects, broadcasting the event live to every screen on the station. Torvik was already in the ring. He stood in the center with his 4 arms spread wide, rolling his massive shoulders, flexing his claws, and his dark iron scales caught the light as he turned slowly to let the crowd see him from every angle. A dominance display, pure and ancient, designed to make his opponent understand what they were facing before a single blow was thrown. His crew stood at the edge of the ring, pounding their fists against their chests in the Draxari war rhythm, and the sound echoed through the hall like a drumbeat. The crowd roared when Kira stepped through the entrance. She was wearing a simple training outfit, shorts, and a fitted top that left her arms bare, and she looked absurdly small against the backdrop of the enormous hall, and a ripple of nervous laughter passed through the spectators, because the contrast between her and Torvik was almost comical. He was 7 feet tall, and 400 pounds of scaled muscle and armor and claws. She was 5'6" and 130 pounds of brown skin and quiet eyes. The Academy's officiator, a tall feathered being named Rand Solith, stepped into the ring and recited the rules of the Ranthari in a high, clear voice. No weapons, no strikes to the eyes, the bout ends when one combatant submits, is rendered unable to continue, or is pinned for a count of 5. And then Rand Solith looked at Kira and asked if she understood the terms. "I understand," Kira said. Rand Solith looked at Torvik. "Begin when ready," Torvik said, and he grinned. Rand Solith stepped out of the ring and raised one feathered arm and brought it down. The duel began. Torvik did not rush in immediately. He circled first, because even arrogance has instincts, and his instincts told him to measure his opponent before committing, and he watched Kira standing in the center of the ring in a loose, balanced stance with her hands up and her weight on the balls of her feet, and her breathing slow and even. She did not circle with him. She did not move at all. She just stood there and watched him with those steady brown eyes, turning her head slightly to track him as he moved, and something about her stillness made the hair on the back of Voss's neck stand up. Though Voss did not have hair, so the translator in his brain supplied the closest equivalent, which was a deep and primal sense that something was very, very wrong. 3 seconds in, Torvik decided he had waited long enough. He lunged. It was fast, blisteringly fast by galactic standards, all 4 arms reaching for Kira at once, claws extended, his massive body closing the distance in a single explosive step, and the crowd gasped because the speed of it was breathtaking, a 400-pound predator moving like a striking snake. Kira sidestepped. She did not jump or dive or scramble. She simply shifted her weight and moved to the left, and Torvik's 4 arms grabbed the empty air where she had been standing a fraction of a second before, and his momentum carried him forward 2 steps past her. The crowd went silent. Not quiet silent, the way a room full of living creatures goes silent when something happens that their brains cannot immediately process. Torvik spun around, and for the first time there was something other than amusement on his face. Confusion, maybe, or the very first seed of something he would not yet call fear, and he swung with his upper right arm, a massive backhanded strike that could have dented steel plating. Kira ducked under it, not backward, but forward, stepping inside his reach where his long arms became a disadvantage rather than an advantage, and she planted her feet and drove the heel of her palm into the center of his chest. The sound it made was something the students in that hall would remember for the rest of their lives. Not a thud and not a crack, but something between the two. A deep, resonant impact that they felt in their bones more than they heard with their ears. And Torvik's iron-colored scales, the natural armor that Draxari bragged could stop a blade, splintered under her palm like dry clay. Torvik staggered backward 3 full steps, and his lower arms clutched at his chest, and his mouth opened but no sound came out because all the air had been driven from his lungs in a single instant. 5 seconds. The crowd was making noise now, not cheering, not yet, but a low, rising murmur of disbelief that sounded almost like fear. Torvik's eyes went wide and red with rage, and he roared a real Draxari battle roar, the kind that triggered a panic response in most galactic species. And he lunged again, but this time with all the savage fury of a wounded animal, slashing with every claw on every hand, and one of them caught Kira's left arm and tore through her skin from elbow to wrist in 3 parallel lines. Blood, red human blood, sprayed across the polished stone of the ring. And the entire hall held its breath, waiting for her to fall, waiting for the shock and the pain to do what it would do to any of them, shut down her motor functions, flood her brain with distress signals, make her body go limp and passive as evolution's mercy took over and told her to stop fighting and start hopping the predator would lose interest. Instead, something happened that Dr. Ilwin, watching from the faculty balcony with her compound eyes fixed on the ring, had been trying to warn them about. Kira's pupils dilated until her brown eyes were almost black. Her heart rate, already elevated, surged, slamming against her ribs at 160 beats per minute, then 180, then higher, and her adrenal glands emptied themselves into her bloodstream like floodgates opening, and her muscles drank the adrenaline like water, and every nerve in her body went from alert to alive in a way that no other species in the galaxy could replicate or even properly understand. She did not slow down. She sped up. A medic student in the 3rd row, a Kelvari studying xenophysiology, saw Kira's biometric readings on her scanner and fainted, because the numbers on the screen were impossible, because no living creature was supposed to get asterisk faster and stronger after being wounded, because that was not how biology worked. That was not how any of this was supposed to work. 7 seconds. Torvik swung again, all 4 arms in a coordinated strike that should have been inescapable, and Kira caught his upper left wrist with both hands, caught it mid-swing, stopping 400 pounds of force dead with her grip, and Torvik felt the bones in his wrist grind together under her fingers, and for the first time in his life, he felt something that his brain had no category for. Something his species had evolved past 100,000 years ago, when they had killed the last predator on their world, and declared themselves the top of the food chain forever. He felt like prey. 8 seconds. Kira pivoted, her entire body turning on one foot, her hips rotating with a mechanical precision that came from 1,000 hours in a gym in Sao Paulo under the watchful eye of a grandmother who had competed in judo at the Pan American Games. And she pulled Torvik's arm across her body and dropped her center of gravity and threw him. 350 pounds of Draxari warrior went over her shoulder and through the air, and hit the stone floor of the ceremonial ring, with an impact that cracked the ancient carvings and sent a shockwave through the gallery that the students in the back row felt in their teeth. 9 seconds. Torvik lay on his back, stunned, the breath knocked out of him for the second time, 2 of his arms twisted at angles that his species was not designed for, and before his brain could even begin to form the thought of getting up, Kira was on him. She dropped one knee onto his chest, pinned his lower arms with her legs, locked his upper left arm with one hand, and pressed her forearm against his throat, not crushing, not choking, just holding, controlling, showing him and everyone watching that she could end this whenever she wanted, and that she was choosing not to. 10 seconds. The hall was so quiet that Kira could hear the hum of the station's engines somewhere deep below the floor. She leaned down, close to Torvik's face, close enough that he could see the blood still running down her arm and dripping onto his cracked scales, and she said, in a voice so quiet that only he and the first row could hear, "On my world we have a saying, pick on someone your own size, but you do not want to know what happens when someone from a world like mine decides to stop being gentle." She held him there for one more second, looking into his wide, terrified eyes, and then she released him and stood up and stepped back. Torvik did not move. He lay on the cracked stone with 3 fractured ribs and 2 dislocated arms, and stared at the ceiling and breathed in short, shallow gasps. And his eyes were the eyes of someone who had just learned something fundamental about the universe that he would never be able to unlearn. The silence lasted 3 more seconds, and then the hall exploded, screaming, shouting, students climbing over each other, faculty rushing toward the ring, medics pushing through the crowd with stretchers and scanners, and the camera drones captured all of it, every angle, every reaction, every frame of the 10 seconds that would change the galaxy's understanding of humanity forever. Dr. Ilwin stood on the faculty balcony and closed her compound eyes and let out a breath she had been holding since the duel began and whispered to herself, "I tried to warn them." Kira walked out of the ring with blood still dripping from her arm and her hands still wrapped in the cloth from the gym in Sao Paulo, and she walked past the screaming crowd, and past the panicking faculty, and past the hovering camera drones, and she walked straight to the spot where Lysae was standing with all 4 hands pressed over her mouth and tears streaming down her lavender face. Kira put her uninjured arm around Lysae's trembling shoulders and pulled her close and said, softly, warmly, like nothing remarkable had happened at all, "He is not going to bother you again." And in the ring behind them, Torvik Rand stared at the ceiling and began to understand, for the first time in his life, what it felt like to be small. The footage reached the inner worlds within an hour. It spread the way all extraordinary things spread in a civilization that had mastered faster-than-light communication, first as a curiosity shared between friends, then as a link passed around workplaces and academic institutions, then as the single most viewed piece of media on the galactic net. Watched and rewatched and analyzed frame by billions of beings on thousands of worlds, who could not quite believe what they were seeing. A human girl, small, soft-skinned, 2-armed, from a species that had only discovered space travel a few decades ago, had dismantled a Draxari warrior in 10 seconds flat, and she had done it with the calm precision of someone who had never for a single moment doubted the outcome. The galaxy had questions. Military analysts from 17 different species requested Earth's full biometric data within the first day, and the requests kept coming after that, formal and urgent and stamped with the highest security clearances. Because if one human girl could do that to a Draxari in a controlled environment without weapons, then what could a trained human soldier do? What could 100 of them do? What could a species of 8 billion Deathworlders do if they ever decided to stop being friendly? Diplomatic security protocols were updated across the Union. Not dramatically, not publicly, but the changes were there if you knew where to look. And suddenly human ambassadors found that their hosts were a little more polite, a little more attentive, a little more careful about making sure the conference rooms were comfortable and the food was good and the negotiations were fair. It was amazing how much respect a 10-second video could buy. On Draxus Prime, the reaction was complicated, because Draxari culture did not have a simple framework for what had happened. Torvik had not been cheated or ambushed or defeated by trickery. He had been beaten cleanly and overwhelmingly in a ritual he himself had invoked. And in the oldest traditions of the warrior caste, that meant something. It meant that the victor had earned dominance and the defeated had to accept it. And that was a bitter medicine for a species that considered itself among the galaxy's finest fighters. Torvik's family quietly withdrew their funding from the Academy's research wing, and no one tried very hard to get it back. And Torvik himself, the bully of Velhari 9, the iron-scaled terror who had ruled the Academy through fear for 3 years, spent 4 days in the medical ward having his ribs regenerated and his arms reset. And during those 4 days, he stared at the ceiling a great deal and said very little. And when he finally returned to the corridors and the classrooms and the dining hall, he was a different creature. Not a better one, not yet. Change like that does not happen in 4 days, but a quieter one, a more careful one, a being who had been forced to confront the possibility that everything he had believed about strength and dominance, and the natural order was built on a foundation so fragile that a girl from a backwater planet could shatter it with her bare hands. He did not seek Kira out. He did not apologize to Lice. But he stopped, and sometimes stopping is where change begins. When other students asked him about the fight, and they all asked, every single one, he gave the same answer every time, and his voice was flat and stripped of all the arrogance that used to fill it. I hit something I did not understand, and I will not make that mistake again. His crew dissolved around him like smoke. Voss was the first to leave, then the others, one by one, and Torvik found himself alone for the first time in his life, walking the corridors without an entourage, eating in the dining hall without a crowd, and he discovered something surprising, which was that being alone was not the same as being weak, and that the silence around him was not emptiness but space, space to think, space to listen. Space to watch the little Kelvari girl he had tormented for months sit with her friends and laugh, without looking over her shoulder. He was not ready to feel sorry, not yet, but he was ready to feel something, and that was enough for now. Kira, meanwhile, hated every second of her new fame. She had not fought Torvik to prove that humans were dangerous. She had fought him because her friend was scared, and no one else was willing to stand between Lice and the thing that scared her. And that was all. That was the entire reason, and she could not understand why the galaxy insisted on turning it into something bigger. Students she had never spoken to stopped her in hallways to take holographic images with her, and professors who had never noticed her suddenly wanted her in their advanced seminars, and the Academy's combat instructor, a grizzled Horthani veteran with one eye and a permanent limp, showed up at her door and asked if she would consider joining the Academy's competitive fighting team, and news outlets from 6 different systems sent interview requests to her student mailbox. She turned down all of it. Instead, she went back to her classes, back to her studies, back to her table in the dining hall with Lysay and Doran, and she signed up to volunteer at the Academy's medical center, where she spent her free evenings helping the staff treat minor injuries and illnesses. And she was gentle with every patient, careful with every bandage, soft-spoken and kind in a way that confused the species who had watched the video and expected to find a warrior. "I do not understand," a young crystalline student told her while she treated a crack in his outer matrix with a bonding compound. "You could have killed the Draxari, and you chose not to, and now you are here fixing broken people instead of basking in your victory. Why?" Kira thought about it for a moment, and then she said, "Where I come from, the strongest people I ever met were the ones who spent their time taking care of others. My grandmother could bench press her own body weight, and she spent every weekend cooking meals for the elderly people on our street, and I always thought that was what strength was actually for." The crystalline student had no framework for understanding this, but he remembered it, and he told other people about it, and they told other people, and slowly, not like a wildfire but like a sunrise, a new idea began to spread through the academy. That the most frightening thing about the Deathworlders was not their strength or their speed or their terrifying chemical rage response. It was that they chose, every single day, to be kind despite being capable of such extraordinary violence, and that the kindness was not a weakness or a disguise but the whole point, the reason they had survived a world that should have killed them. Because somewhere in their brutal evolutionary history, they had discovered that the most effective survival strategy was not to be the strongest individual, but to be the species that took care of each other. Lysay changed too. Not overnight and not dramatically, but steadily in small ways that added up. She stopped flinching when larger students walked past her. She started speaking up in class. She joined a student advocacy group. And one afternoon she saw a group of older students cornering a first-year mechari in a hallway, and she walked up to them with all four arms folded across her chest and said, in a voice that trembled only slightly, "That is enough." The older students looked at her, and then they looked at each other, and then they walked away, because everyone at the academy knew who Lysay's friends were. Doran never said much about any of it, because Doran never said much about anything, but he watched, and he listened, and he kept a quiet record of everything that happened in the weeks and months after the duel, because he was a mechari and his people valued observation above all things, and he wanted to remember this, not the fight, but what came after it, the way one small act of courage sent ripples outward through a community and changed the shape of it. 3 months after the duel, the Galactic Union Council convened a special session to discuss the status of Earth and its inhabitants, and the resolution that came out of that session was unprecedented. A formal motion to fast-track humanity's application for full Union membership, bypassing the standard 50-year probationary period. On the grounds that a species forged in the crucible of a Class 12 Deathworld, that had still chosen compassion and cooperation and diplomacy as its guiding principles, was not a species the galaxy could afford to keep at arm's length. The vote passed with an overwhelming majority, and only the Draxari delegation abstained. The news was broadcast on every screen on the Academy station, and students gathered in the atrium to watch the ticker scroll across the dome. Galactic Council votes to fast-track Earth's full Union membership. Kira was not in the atrium. She was in the garden on the station's outer ring, a quiet place full of plants from 100 different worlds, where the artificial sunlight was warm and the air smelled like things growing, and she was sitting on a bench with Lysay on one side and Doran on the other, and Lysay was struggling with her botanical xenoscience homework, and Kira was trying to explain the concept of photosynthesis in a way that made sense across species, and Doran was pretending to read a book, but was actually just enjoying the company. The news ticker was visible through the garden's transparent ceiling, scrolling silently against the stars, but none of them were looking up. Doran glanced at Kira, at this small, scarred human girl with the bandaged arm and the easy laugh, and the gentle hands that had cracked Draxari armor like an eggshell. And he thought about everything he had seen in the past 3 months, about the duel and the aftermath, and the way Kira had turned fear into respect and respect into something that looked a lot like hope. He looked back at his book and let himself think the thought that had been forming in his mind for weeks, the thought he would one day write in the introduction to his senior thesis on interspecies social dynamics, the paper that would make him famous in academic circles across the Union. The galaxy had been wrong about Deathworlds. They did not just produce survivors. They did not just produce warriors. They did not just produce creatures that could break a Draxari in 10 seconds and walk away without a scratch. They produced protectors, beings who had been forged in violence, and had come out the other side with a fierce and unshakable commitment to making sure that no one around them ever had to face that violence alone. That was what made the humans dangerous. Not their fists, their kindness. And in the garden, in the warm artificial light, surrounded by alien plants and alien friends on a station spinning slowly in the dark between the stars, Kira Vasquez, Deathworlder, Protector, and the most terrifying thing the galaxy had ever misunderstood, helped her best friend with her homework and did not think about any of it at all.